There is a rhythm to political collapse. Not a marching band, not the roar of crowds, but a quieter, colder beat. A tax ledger that no longer balances, an election no one trusts, a convoy of black cars gliding past people who can't afford bread. It's the sound of a system slipping out of alignment with the people who live inside it. And every time in history that sound has grown loud enough, the ending has been the same: revolution. Over the last 250 years, that rhythm has toppled three seemingly solid regimes. In 1789, France stood as the most prestigious power in Europe, wealthy, cultured, the beating heart of Enlightenment thought. Within 5 years, its king was decapitated in a public square, and roughly 40,000 people were executed in a wave of political purges we now call the Terror. In 1917, the Russian Empire stretched from Europe to the Pacific, ruled by a dynasty that had held power for 3 centuries. 8 months later, the Tsar was gone, the monarchy dissolved, and a revolutionary vanguard seized control, setting off civil war, famine, and purges that would ultimately kill tens of millions. In 1959, Cuba looked like a Caribbean success story. Tourists, casinos, American investment, one of the highest standards of living in Latin America. 2 years later, Fidel Castro had overthrown the regime, nationalized the economy, and locked the island into a dictatorship that would last 6 decades. 3 times, 3 different countries, 3 different ideologies. Same outcome. What looked stable collapsed into chaos. And the most disturbing part isn't that these revolutions happened, it's that the people in charge never believed they could. They thought they were untouchable. They thought the peasants wouldn't rise, that the workers would grumble but comply, that the middle class would always choose stability over risk. They thought the system itself was too strong to fall. They were wrong. Every single time. And in 2025, the hard truth is this: every warning sign that burned like a fuse before those revolutions, extreme inequality, open corruption, collapsing trust in institutions, simmering rage, is now visible in the United States. We're not approaching the pattern. We're already inside it. According to this historical script, the U.S. is in stage 4 of a 6-stage revolution cycle. And history suggests that once a society reaches stage 4, stage 5 and 6 move quickly. This is the story of how revolutions really happen, why governments almost never see them coming, and why the logic of this pattern suggests that America is not exempt. Before we walk through the 6 stages, we need to strip away the romantic myth around revolution. A revolution is not a big protest. It's not a messy election. It's not even a riot. A revolution is when the existing order, its laws, its power structures, its property rights, its very idea of legitimacy is broken and replaced often violently by something new. And most of the time, what replaces it is not a utopia. It's worse. Revolutions don't happen simply because people are poor. Poverty is as old as civilization. For most of human history, people scraped by and didn't overthrow their rulers. Revolutions ignite when expectations rise faster than reality can deliver. When people become convinced they deserve far more than they're getting, and that those above them are rigging the game. They begin to compare their lives not just to the past, but to the lifestyles they see in palaces, in city centers, on their neighbors' tables, and today, on their screens. The gap between the elite and everyone else stops being an economic difference. It becomes a moral insult. That's where the social contract begins to crack. If I do my part and the system never rewards me, if the courts don't protect me, if the elections don't represent me, if the government doesn't hear me, why should I respect any of it? And then comes the most dangerous shift of all, when a critical mass of people loses faith that the system can fix itself. If peaceful reform feels impossible, violent revolution starts to look inevitable. That's not a radical slogan. That's the logic captured perfectly by John F. Kennedy. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. History has been writing footnotes to that sentence ever since. France, Russia, Cuba. 3 different centuries, 3 different ideologies. Each one followed the same 6-stage sequence from stability to collapse. To see where America sits in that sequence, you first have to see how clearly it unfolded in the past. So we begin where modern revolution, as we think of it today, was born. France. 1789. In the 1880s, France looked like the center of the civilized world. Paris was the cultural capital of Europe. French was the language of diplomacy and high society. Its philosophers, Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, had reshaped the way Europe thought about reason, rights, and the state. Art, literature, and science thrived. On paper, it was a golden age. At the top sat King Louis XVI, the latest in a monarchy that had ruled France for roughly 800 years. The Bourbon dynasty seemed as permanent as the stone of Versailles itself. But like all systems near breaking point, the facade hid a deep structural rot. This is stage 1 of every revolution: extreme wealth inequality. In 1789, France's 27 million people were divided into 3 estates. The first estate, the clergy, maybe 130,000 people, owned about 10% of the land and paid no taxes. The second estate, the nobility, about 400,000 people, owned about 25% of the land and paid almost no taxes. The third estate, everyone else, roughly 26 million peasants, workers, merchants, professionals, they carried nearly all of the tax burden. Roughly 1.5% of the population paid essentially nothing. The other 98.5% carried the weight of the state on their backs. And it wasn't just numbers on a ledger. The nobility enjoyed privileges that went well beyond wealth. They could hunt on peasant land and ride through fields destroying crops with impunity. They could demand forced labor for roads and projects. They lived in lavish estates and glittering salons, while entire villages starved in the countryside. By 1788, nature delivered the final insult, a disastrous harvest. The price of bread, the basic fuel of the French diet, spiked. For a peasant family, bread was not a side dish, it was life itself, often consuming most of the household budget. When prices doubled, it wasn't an inconvenience, it meant there simply wasn't enough food. In the cities, long bread lines formed. In the countryside, people boiled grass and bark. Rumors of hoarding and speculation by grain merchants spread like wildfire. And yet at Versailles, the nobility continued their 5-course meals, elaborate balls, and costume parties. Within a single country, 2 realities coexisted: hunger and chandeliers. The gap wasn't just an economic difference, it was a moral insult. The people at the top literally did not live in the same world as those at the bottom. That takes us to stage 2, government corruption and incompetence. Louis XVI wasn't a monstrous tyrant. In many ways, he was something more dangerous at a moment of crisis, weak, indecisive, and completely unequal to the scale of the problem. France was effectively bankrupt. Decades of war, including the expensive decision to support the American colonists against Britain, had piled up enormous debts. The rational options were simple, though politically deadly. Tax the nobility and clergy, cut spending at the top, reform the system. Instead, the crown did what fragile regimes always do. It borrowed more. It raised taxes on those already paying everything. It cut nothing meaningful from the elite. Whenever Louis tried to touch noble or clerical privilege, those same elites blocked reform. They would rather risk the country sliding towards collapse than sacrifice their position. By 1789, the equation no longer worked. The government couldn't pay its creditors, the people couldn't afford bread, the old mechanisms for adjustment were jammed. So Louis reached for an institution that hadn't met in 174 years.
The Estates General, a representative assembly of the three estates. He believed it would legitimize new taxes. What he actually did was reintroduce a dormant political bomb into a country already soaked in resentment. This is where stage 3 begins. The middle class damaged and radicalized. The Third Estate, remember, wasn't just peasants. It also included the emerging bourgeoisie, lawyers, merchants, professionals, educated city dwellers. They had more to lose, more education, more political vocabulary. They read the philosophers. They understood rights. And they were tired of being treated as second-class subjects. When the Estates General convened, voting was structured by estate, not by head. One vote for the clergy, one vote for the nobility, one vote for everyone else. On paper, that meant that 1.5% of the population, First and Second Estates combined, could outvote the remaining 98.5% 2-1. The Third Estate demanded change. One person, one vote. They wanted representation matching their actual numbers. Louis refused. In that moment, a crucial psychological line was crossed. On June 17, 1789, the representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, the true voice of the French nation. Locked out of their usual meeting hall, they gathered in a nearby tennis court and swore a collective oath. They would not disband until France had a constitution. In a single gesture, the educated middle strata, the people who normally stabilize a system, publicly declared that the old order was illegitimate. That's the pivot every revolution needs. When the middle class, the lawyers, the merchants, the professionals, say, "This government no longer represents us," revolution is no longer a fantasy, it is a trajectory. Less than a month later, that trajectory exploded into the open. On July 14, 1789, Parisians stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress prison that had become a symbol of royal arbitrary power. They killed guards, seized weapons, and marched through the streets carrying severed heads on pikes. The world's most cultured capital had turned a prison into a political altar. The French Revolution had begun. And from this point on, events would accelerate beyond anyone's control.
Once the Bastille fell, something irreversible shifted in the French psyche. The facade of royal authority, those marble halls, gilded carriages, velvet-draped councils, suddenly looked fragile, almost theatrical. The monarchy still existed, yes. The nobles still held their titles, the clergy still owned their land. But legitimacy, that invisible glue that holds societies together, had snapped. This is stage 4 of every revolution, the loss of faith in institutions. Institutions don't collapse when buildings burn. They collapse when people stop believing they matter. In France, all the pillars of the old regime, the monarchy, the church, the courts, the provincial parliaments, were hollowed by decades of excess and paralysis. When the National Assembly abolished feudal dues, seized church lands, and signed the Declaration of the Rights of Man, they weren't just passing laws, they were declaring the old system dead. But history shows that when you dismantle an old system quickly, a vacuum opens just as quickly. Into that vacuum rush radical energy. The moderates, the ones who wanted constitutional monarchy, a fairer tax system, gradual reform, were overwhelmed by events moving faster than their proposals. Bread was still scarce, inflation soared, the economy struggled under the weight of uncertainty, and every unmet expectation widened the appetite for more extreme solutions. This brings us to Stage 5. Revolutionary movement gains mass support. The Jacobins, led by the sharp-tongued and ascetic Maximilien Robespierre, began as a political club, but as conditions worsened, their message spread. The king must die, the aristocracy must be purged, the enemies of the people must be eliminated. It was the politics of purity, and in times of desperation, purity is seductive. Robespierre promised virtue, but to enforce virtue, he needed fear. The guillotine became his punctuation mark. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed before a crowd. His wife, Marie Antoinette, followed 9 months later. Their deaths symbolized something deeper than punishment. They signaled that the old contract between ruler and ruled had been violently severed. With the monarchy dead, the revolution entered its darkest phase. This is Stage 6. Government overthrown, chaos follows. From 1793 to 1794, the Committee of Public Safety unleashed the terror. Nearly 40,000 people were executed, nobles, clergy, moderates, suspected counter-revolutionaries, even fellow radicals. No one was safe. The guillotine didn't just take lives, it reshaped political logic. Accusation became evidence, dissent became treason, silence became a death sentence. The terror devoured its architects. Robespierre, who once condemned executions as barbaric, was himself guillotined by the system he created. By 1999, France was exhausted, ravaged by inflation, famine, foreign wars, and years of political violence. Into this wreckage stepped a brilliant young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, who seized power in a coup and transformed France into a military dictatorship that would drag Europe into 15 years of war. The revolution that began with liberty, equality, fraternity ended with a self-crowned emperor. That is the story of France, a story repeated with chilling precision more than a century later. Russia, 1917, a giant with feet of clay. Fast forward to the early 20th century. Russia, superficially, was one of the world's great powers. Its empire spanned a sixth of the planet. The Romanov dynasty had ruled for 300 years, and Tsar Nicholas II sat at the apex of a rigid social pyramid. But beneath the glitter of imperial parades and orthodox ceremony, the same rot that hollowed France was spreading. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. Russia's peasants, around 80% of the population, owned virtually nothing. Even after the abolition of serfdom in 1861, most were tied to land they didn't control, bound by debt and rent. In the cities, industrial workers labored in brutal conditions, 12 to 14 hours a day, miserly wages, child labor, no safety laws. Meanwhile, the nobility danced at winter balls in St. Petersburg, where a single evening's expenses could exceed a peasant's lifetime earnings. Stage 2. government corruption, and incompetence. Nicholas II was, in many ways, a tragic figure. Devout, soft-spoken, convinced of his divine right to rule, yet utterly unprepared for the demands of a modern industrial empire. When peaceful protesters marched on the Winter Palace in 1905 to request better wages and basic rights, troops fired on them. Hundreds died. Bloody Sunday shattered any remaining belief that the Tsar was a protective father figure. Then came World War I, and with it, the total collapse of Russia's logistical, military, and political systems. Millions were sent to the front without rifles, ammunition, boots, or food. Entire divisions surrendered or mutinied. Railways broke down, factories starved of supplies, inflation soared. While soldiers died in trenches, Nicholas and his family retreated into insulated luxury, guided by the bizarre influence of Rasputin, a wandering mystic who had captivated the imperial family. By early 1917, the strain was unbearable. Women in Petrograd queuing for bread began protesting. Workers joined them. Factories shut down. The Tsar ordered troops to restore order, but the soldiers refused. This was the Russian version of the tennis court oath. The moment the military abandons the government is finished. Stage 4. Middle class and military turn against the regime. Nicholas abdicated on March 15, 1917. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended not with a battle, but with a signature. A provisional government took over, educated, liberal, democratic in intent, but it made the fatal mistake of staying in the war. The same workers who demanded bread got speeches instead. The same soldiers who wanted peace were ordered back to the trenches.
Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. The provisional government, within months, was seen as illegitimate, weak, and disconnected, much like Louis XVI's monarchy had been. Into this vacuum stepped a revolutionary organization with discipline, ideology, and a clear message. Stage 5. Revolutionary movement gains mass support. Lenin and the Bolsheviks promised peace, land, bread. 3 words that captured the suffering of millions. On October 25, 1917, they stormed the Winter Palace and seized power in a nearly bloodless coup. But what came next was anything but bloodless. Stage 6. Government overthrown. Chaos follows. The Russian Civil War was a hurricane of violence. Reds versus whites. Villages burned. Famines ravaged the countryside. The Tsar and his entire family were executed in a basement. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had won, but at the cost of roughly 10 million lives. Famine and purges would claim tens of millions more under Stalin. The revolution that promised liberation delivered one of the century's most repressive regimes. France, Russia. 2 empires, one elegant, one colossal, both undone by the same structural weaknesses. And then just decades later, the cycle repeated again, but this time on a small Caribbean island. Analytical documentary. Balanced, factual, clear, like Economy Rewind. By the mid-20th century, the next great revolution was brewing. Not in a starving medieval kingdom, and not in a decaying empire, but in a place that, on paper, should have been immune. Cuba, 1950s. A tropical playground. American tourists. Mob-run casinos pouring out liquor, music, and money. Havana, called the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean, glowed with neon and foreign investment.
Cuba's GDP per capita ranked among the highest in Latin America. Illiteracy, compared to its neighbors, was relatively low. Cuban doctors and musicians were exported to the world. But like every revolution before it, the foundation was rotting beneath the glossy surface. Because revolutions do not ignite from poverty alone. They ignite when reality and expectation split wide open. When the promised dream diverges violently from people's lived experience. That is exactly what happened in Cuba. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. The island's prosperity was real, but it was extremely concentrated. The wealth flowed through Havana like a gilded river, pooling around Batista's allies, casino owners, sugar barons, and U.S. corporations. But outside the capital? Drive east beyond the glittering Malecon, and you entered a different Cuba entirely. Rural poverty was rampant. Shacks with dirt floors, children without shoes, families surviving on cane-cutting wages that barely fed them. Sugar, Cuba's main economic artery, was dominated by foreign ownership. A few American companies controlled vast plantations. Most profits left the island long before they reached the pockets of Cuban workers. The inequality wasn't merely financial. It was geographic, cultural, and humiliatingly visible. In Havana, cocktail dresses, roulette wheels, American Chevrolets. In the countryside, malnutrition, illiteracy, and hopelessness. That contrast, bright neon beside rural hunger, is gasoline poured on revolutionary flames. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. Fulgencio Batista seized power in a 1952 coup. One man, one decree. Democracy shut off like a light switch. And in the darkness, corruption flourished. Police accepted bribes as easily as they accepted orders. Judges sold verdicts. Business contracts were allocated based on loyalty, not law. American mobsters bought influence and ran casinos openly, splitting profits with Batista's inner circle. It wasn't simply corruption. It was predation. Protests were met with torture, disappearances, and bullets. Political opposition wasn't debated, it was silenced. Young Cubans, many from educated families, watched their country being strip-mined by a coalition of politicians, generals, and foreign interests. And as always, when the system actively harms the very people it is supposed to protect, Stage 3 begins. Stage 3. Middle class radicalized. Revolutions rarely start with the poorest. They start with the educated. Those who can see how unjust the system is. Those with enough knowledge to articulate it and enough frustration to act. Enter Fidel Castro. A lawyer, not a peasant, not an illiterate farmer, a man who belonged to the very class that should have benefited from the system. But he saw what was happening. He saw the rot, and unlike most, he refused to stay silent. In 1953, Castro led an attack on the Moncada barracks. The operation was amateurish and failed. He was arrested. But at his trial, he delivered a speech that electrified a generation. History will absolve me. Those words became a rallying cry. Imprisonment only intensified his mythos. Released in 1955, he fled to Mexico, regrouped, and returned in 1956 with 82 men aboard a tiny yacht named Grandma. Batista's forces decimated them. Only 20 survived. Any rational insurgent would have fled again. Castro didn't, because he understood something crucial. Batista's brutality was doing more to strengthen the revolution than any speech or manifesto ever could. And that leads to Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. When a government loses legitimacy, violence becomes oxygen. Every crackdown by Batista backfired. Every tortured student created 10 new rebels. Every burned village produced a fresh wave of recruits. The Cuban Revolution didn't grow because Marxism enchanted the masses. It grew because Batista suffocated them. Even the United States, Batista's primary foreign sponsor, began to distance themselves. Washington saw the writing on the wall. When your foreign backer abandons you, the clock starts ticking fast. Government, courts, police, elections all lost credibility. This is the point of no return. And soon, the revolution had momentum no army could stop. Stage 5. Revolutionary movement gains mass support. By 1958, Castro's guerrilla force had grown into thousands. Urban underground cells coordinated strikes and sabotage. Peasants sheltered fighters and fed them. Students, intellectuals, and professionals rallied behind the cause. Batista's army, corrupt, demoralized, and poorly paid, collapsed under pressure. Entire units deserted. Officers fled with stolen fortunes. On January 1, 1959, Batista escaped Cuba with an estimated $300 million in cash. 1 week later, Fidel Castro entered Havana. Crowds cheered, flags waved. The revolution was victorious. But, as France and Russia had shown, victory has two faces. Stage 6. Government overthrown. Chaos follows. At first, Castro promised democracy, free press, open elections. It took only months for the mask to drop. Political opponents were rounded up. Courts became instruments of propaganda. Executions began, hundreds in the first year alone. Thousands fled to Miami. Cuba's middle class, who had helped Castro rise, realized too late that they hadn't toppled a dictator. They had installed a new one. Factories, farms, homes, land, all nationalized. Dissent criminalized. Freedom replaced by ideology. Cuba remained a dictatorship for 60 years, ruled first by Fidel and then by his brother Raúl. The revolution that promised liberation delivered poverty, repression, and exile, just as France had, just as Russia had, just as every extreme revolution eventually does. 3 revolutions, 3 centuries, 1 pattern. France, Russia, Cuba. Different eras, different cultures, different ideologies. Same 6-stage cycle. Same collapse of the old order. Same rise of something darker. And now, for the first time, we turn the camera towards the modern era. Because the next chapter of this pattern is unfolding not in Europe or the Caribbean, but in the United States.